Former President Donald Trump and influential entertainer Tucker Carlson have recently caught the attention of the American society in their interview. If you watch carefully, you'll realize that they are trying to tell us something, and it's only in you and the American society's interest to pay as much attention as possible. The situation in Ukraine is at a critical point. The growing tension between Ukraine, a democracy-driven government, and Russia, which is run by Putin, a leader with a lot of power and essentially a dictator. Ukraine wants to make its own decisions and remain friends with other democratic countries like the United States and Europe. But Russia, like the bully from school, doesn't like that and is trying to control Ukraine. This whole conflict has thus become a struggle between democracy and dictatorship. Imagine two teams playing a game. One team wants everyone to have a say and play fair, such as what happens in a democracy. The other team wants to control everything and make up their own rules, such as what happens in a dictatorship. That's kind of what's happening between Ukraine and Russia. Ukraine wants to be free and make its own choices, but Russia wants to hold control over them. In between these two teams, however, is the question of America's involvement. There's this important law called the Neutrality Act, which decides what Americans can and can't do when other countries are fighting. It's like a rule book to make sure Americans don't accidentally get involved in other countries' fights. But sometimes understanding this law can be tricky, and it's really important for everyone to know what they're allowed to do. The situation in Ukraine doesn't just affect Ukraine and Russia, it's a big deal for the whole world, including the United States. If things get worse, it could lead to bigger problems, even wars. So it's really important for everyone, especially leaders in the US, to pay attention to what's going on and figure out the best way to handle it. Back when the United States was fighting for independence from British rule, there were people from other countries who wanted to help. Some of them, like General Lafayette from France, joined the American side and became really important in the fight. But after the war, the leaders of the new United States were worried that Americans might go to other countries to fight in their wars. They were afraid this could cause big problems, so they made rules to stop it. This was the start of what we now call the Neutrality Act. When World War I broke out, the United States didn't want to get involved. They wanted to stay neutral, which means they didn't want to take sides in the fight. The government passed laws to make sure Americans didn't join the war on either side. This was because they thought that if Americans went to fight in Europe, it could drag the United States into the war, and that would be very dangerous. So the Neutrality Act was used to keep Americans from getting involved in the conflict. Over time, the Neutrality Act has changed and adapted to fit different situations. As the world changed and new conflicts arose, lawmakers updated the law to make sure it still worked to keep Americans safe and out of trouble. These changes were made to address new challenges and keep up with the ever-changing international landscape. Right now, the Neutrality Act is still in effect, but it's not always strictly enforced. Sometimes the government chooses to prioritize other laws or issues over enforcing the Neutrality Act. This can lead to confusion about what's allowed and what's not when it comes to Americans getting involved in conflicts like the one in Ukraine. One big problem with the Neutrality Act is that it's not always clear how it should be applied to modern situations. With conflicts evolving and new types of warfare emerging, it can be hard to figure out exactly what actions are covered by the law. This can create challenges for both lawmakers and law enforcement officials who are trying to interpret and enforce the Neutrality Act effectively. The Neutrality Act lays out rules that Americans need to follow when it comes to getting involved in conflicts in other countries. If Americans go to Ukraine to fight without the approval of the US government, they could be breaking this law. Former President Donald Trump has pointed out that if Americans ignore the rules of the Neutrality Act and get involved in the conflict in Ukraine, they could face serious consequences. It's not too surprising that Donald Trump has taken this stance, considering he just encouraged Vladimir Putin to attack anyone who doesn't pay their bills to Russia. However, breaking the Neutrality Act is a serious offense, and those who violate it could face fines, imprisonment, or other legal penalties. So Americans need to think carefully before getting involved in foreign conflicts like the one in Ukraine, and consider the potential legal risks involved. While the Neutrality Act provides guidelines for American involvement in foreign conflicts, there are often gray areas and uncertainties that make enforcement challenging, like doing the right thing. These unclear areas can arise due to the complexity of modern conflicts and the evolving nature of warfare. Additionally, determining the extent to which individuals may be held accountable under the Neutrality Act can be difficult, especially when considering factors such as intent, context, and the specifics of each situation. Law enforcement agencies may struggle to interpret and apply the law consistently, leading to enforcement challenges and varying outcomes in different cases. Individuals who are considering joining the conflict in Ukraine may have personal motivations and beliefs driving their decisions. However, it's essential to consider how their actions align with broader national interests and policies. While individuals may feel compelled to support causes they believe in, it's crucial to recognize the potential impact of their actions on diplomatic relations, international stability, and the safety of Americans and others involved in the conflict. Balancing personal convictions with national policy is essential to ensure coherence and consistency in foreign affairs. American involvement in foreign conflicts can have far-reaching consequences, both intended and unintended. While individuals may hope to make a positive difference by joining the fight in Ukraine, their actions could inadvertently escalate the conflict, endanger civilian lives, or provoke retaliation from opposing forces. Moreover, Tucker Carlson's probing questions have revealed that American intervention may complicate diplomatic efforts to resolve the conflict peacefully and strain relations with other countries involved. However, it's quite clear that Vladimir Putin has no intention of resolving the conflict peacefully. So far, all that's been mentioned earlier has broadened on the involvement of civilians who, driven by passion, have desired to support the Ukrainians, because it's the right thing to do. But what happens when the more experienced cross-section like mercenaries, former SEALs, and special forces teams and individuals decide to join the fight? Such a type of involvement in the conflict in Ukraine could potentially bolster the military capabilities and expertise of Ukrainian forces. Americans with military training and combat experience may provide valuable support to Ukrainian troops, enhancing their effectiveness in resisting Russian aggression. Additionally, individuals with specialized skills such as special operation training could contribute to strategic operations and tactics, further strengthening Ukraine's defensive capabilities. However, the extent to which American involvement can significantly impact the outcome of the conflict remains uncertain and depends on various factors, including the scale and duration of their participation. The involvement of American fighters in the conflict could provoke different perceptions and reactions from Russia and NATO. Russia may view American participation as a provocative act and may respond with increased hostility or aggression. This could escalate tensions between Russia and the United States, potentially leading to further military confrontations or diplomatic crises. On the other hand, NATO countries may perceive American involvement as a demonstration of solidarity with Ukraine and a commitment to defending democracies. However, NATO may also be concerned about the potential implications of American intervention for the broader security landscape in Europe and beyond. Overall, American involvement in the conflict could have significant geopolitical implications and may impact the dynamics of relations between major global powers. American involvement in the conflict in Ukraine carries the risk of escalating the situation beyond Ukraine's borders. If tensions between the US and Russia increase due to American intervention, there's a possibility the conflict could spill over into neighboring countries or even involve other regions. This could lead to a wider regional conflict with far-reaching consequences for stability and security in Europe and beyond. Additionally, the involvement of NATO allies could further complicate the situation, potentially triggering Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, which obligates member states to come to the defense of any ally under attack. Take a wild guess where that could be taking us. One of the most significant risks associated with the conflict in Ukraine is the potential for nuclear escalation. Russia, as a nuclear-armed state, has the capability to deploy nuclear weapons, and dictator Vladimir Putin has previously made veiled threats regarding the use of nuclear weapons. Any escalation of the conflict that threatens Russia's security interests could increase the risk of nuclear confrontation, leading to catastrophic consequences for global security. Moreover, the involvement of other nuclear-armed states, such as the United States, could further worsen the situation and raise the likelihood of a nuclear conflict. Therefore, it's essential for all parties involved to exercise restraint and seek diplomatic solutions to de-escalate tensions and prevent the situation from spiraling out of control. Both the executive branch and Congress play crucial roles in responding to the situation regarding American involvement in the conflict in Ukraine. There's a pressing need for clarity and decisive action from these branches of government to address the legal and ethical implications of Americans fighting in foreign conflicts. The executive branch, led by the president, must provide clear guidance and direction on the government's stance regarding American participation in the Ukraine war. This includes clarifying the interpretation and enforcement of the Neutrality Act. Given the complexities of modern conflicts and the evolving nature of warfare, there may be a need to consider amending the Neutrality Act to better address current challenges and unpredictable dictators like Vladimir Putin. Congress, as the legislative body responsible for making and amending laws, should carefully consider potential revisions to the Neutrality Act that reflect contemporary realities and provide clearer guidance on American involvement in foreign conflicts. However, lately, Congress has been busy shooting down a bipartisan border security bill, so it's unlikely they'll be able to take up anything like this. However, Congress should consider whether specific exemptions or provisions are needed to address the unique circumstances of the conflict in Ukraine and future foreign conflicts. Any amendments to the Neutrality Act should be carefully crafted to strike a balance between protecting national security interests and upholding democratic principles and human rights. In addition to executive action, Congress should consider legislative measures to provide clearer guidance and restrictions on American participation in foreign wars. This could involve introducing new legislation or amending existing laws, such as the Neutrality Act, to address challenges posed by modern conflicts and ensure that American foreign policy objectives are effectively pursued. These legislative measures could include explicitly permitting or prohibiting American participation in specific foreign conflicts, including the war in Ukraine, through targeted legislation. It would also help to establish clearer criteria and procedures for determining the legality of individual actions related to foreign conflicts, including provisions for oversight and accountability. Again, strengthening enforcement mechanisms and penalties for violations of laws related to American involvement in foreign wars will deter individuals from engaging in illegal activities. Another important measure would be to provide exemptions or safeguards for individuals engaged in humanitarian or peacekeeping efforts in foreign conflict zones, while still ensuring compliance with relevant legal requirements. By enacting legislative measures, Congress can help clarify the legal framework governing American participation in foreign wars and provide policy makers, law enforcement officials, and individuals with the guidance and restrictions needed to navigate complex international situations responsibly and ethically. President Trump's claim of America First policy, which he frequently emphasized during his presidency, was supposed to prioritize the interests and well-being of the United States above all else, except of course when it came to imposing tariffs on China that had the direct result of making everything more expensive for most Americans and contributing to the ballooning prices during inflation. While it can be quite popular to use the phrase America First, it doesn't necessarily mean that your policies will result in something that will benefit Americans directly. However, Trump's America First policy was supposed to put a strong emphasis on addressing domestic concerns and promoting economic prosperity within the United States. He advocated for policies aimed at revitalizing American industries, bringing back manufacturing jobs, and renegotiating trade deals to ensure that they're more favorable for the United States. However, most of them were actually not more favorable for the United States after the negotiations. In contrast to previous administrations, Trump's approach to foreign policy was characterized by a more limited and selective engagement with the international community. Unlike previous presidents, Donald Trump cozied up to dictators, often praising them for their harsh methods. Trump claimed he wanted to reduce U.S. involvement in global conflicts and military interventions, advocating for a more restrained and transactional approach to international relations. His administration prioritized bilateral relationships over multilateral agreements and institutions, often adopting a more confrontational stance towards traditional allies and trading partners, and at the same time inexplicably cozying up to Vladimir Putin. This interesting policy by the Trump administration reflected a skepticism of long-standing international commitments and agreements, including alliances such as NATO and multilateral trade agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership or TPP. He frequently criticized these arrangements as being unfair to the United States. However, in hindsight, it's widely agreed that the TPP was beneficial to the U.S. economy. And what Trump's administration has done has seriously damaged both the US economy and its ranking in the world economy generally. They agree that Trump handed the top spot to China on a plate. Additionally, Trump's criticism of NATO, which had kept the world out of World War III, led to tensions with traditional allies and raised concerns about the United States' commitment to global leadership and cooperation. Central to Trump's, quote, "America first," end quote, policy was a focus on sovereignty and the protection of national interests. Trump argued for a more selfish return to traditional understandings of sovereignty, where nations prioritize their own selfish interests and autonomy over global cooperation and integration. This emphasis on sovereignty manifested in policies such as the withdrawal from international agreements like the Paris Climate Accord and the Iran nuclear deal, as well as efforts to renegotiate trade agreements. Overall, Trump's America First policy represented a departure from conventional approaches to foreign policy and diplomacy, emphasizing unilateralism, protectionism, and prioritization of domestic concerns over international obligations. However, while it resonated with rural America who felt left behind by globalization and internationalism, it also generated criticism and concern both domestically and internationally about its implications for global stability and cooperation. To most people, it felt like a step backward. Let's talk about neutrality as a concept of foreign policy. It's been long debated and evaluated in the context of changing political and economic landscapes. In the current era of interconnectedness and global interdependence, assessing the relevance and effectiveness of neutrality poses significant challenges. In an era of globalization where economies are increasingly interconnected and interdependent, maintaining strict neutrality in foreign affairs can be impossible. Economic ties between nations often transcend political boundaries, making it challenging or nearly impossible for countries to remain completely neutral in conflicts that may disrupt global supply chains or impact international trade. Moreover, economic sanctions and trade embargoes, commonly used as diplomatic tools, can seem like a nice idea, but just end up costing everyone more money. After all, China did not pay the tariffs, Americans did, who buy most of their products from China. The rise of non-state actors such as terrorist organizations and transitional criminal networks presents new challenges to traditional notions of neutrality. These actors operate outside of conventional state boundaries and often disregard principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity. Then there are those asymmetric threats, such as cyber attacks and terrorism, which can target countries regardless of their official stance of neutrality, posing significant security challenges that require international cooperation and collective action. Neutrality in the face of humanitarian crises and human rights abuses raises ethical dilemmas for countries committed to upholding universal values and principles like the United States. As such, countries must carefully balance the imperative of neutrality with their moral obligations to protect human rights and prevent atrocities, particularly in situations of mass displacement, genocide, or ethnic cleansing. The invasion of digital technology and the advent of information warfare have further complicated the concept of neutrality in the modern era. Cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, and cyber espionage, similar to the attacks that Russia perpetrated on the US in 2016. They can be used as tools of coercion and influence by the state and non-state actors, blurring the lines between traditional notions of neutrality and active engagement in information warfare. In light of these challenges, evaluating neutrality in the context of current political and economic challenges requires an unbiased understanding of the complexities of modern conflict and diplomacy. While the principles of neutrality remain relevant as guiding principles of foreign policy, they must be adapted to address the evolving dynamics of international relations and the changing nature of security threats in the 21st century. Not to mention, we cannot stand idly by while dictators murder people in democracies, if we actually claim to care about the democratic process. The crisis in Ukraine represents one of the most pressing international security challenges of our time, with implications for regional stability, global security, and the future of democratic governance. The illegal invasion of Ukraine by Russian dictator Vladimir Putin threatens the sovereignty and territorial integrity of a democratic nation and poses a direct challenge to the rules-based international order. Urgent action is needed to address the crisis and prevent further escalation of hostilities. In navigating the complexities of the crisis in Ukraine, it's essential for government officials and policymakers to engage in informed decision-making and provide clear and transparent guidance to the public. This includes clarifying the legal framework governing American participation in foreign wars, addressing ambiguities and enforcing challenges in the Neutrality Act, and evaluating the potential strategic implications of American involvement on the conflict and broader geopolitical dynamics. So, while the situation in Ukraine is a very concerning one, America may want to watch its next step, because a mistaken one could take us to the start of a full-blooded World War III. However, if Ukraine does fall into Russian hands, it will show dictators like Vladimir Putin that they can willfully invade countries, and no one will stop them. Until next time.